Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Uniting for Workplace Equity, a partnered effort between the Employee Rights Center and the Kim Center for Social Balance. I'm Dr. Hei-ock Kim, Executive Director of the Kim Center. We're a nonprofit dedicated to accelerating workplace equity for all employees through collaborative effort. Our LEAPS initiative unites communities around a structured program of rigorous assessment, targeted action, and standardized accountability. We're grateful to ERC for hosting this series, and with me is Alor Calderon, Executive Director.
Hi, everybody. Alor Calderon, Director of the Employee Rights Center and huge supporter of the work that Dr. Kim is doing and the center is doing. And thank you for all being here. We have been doing this on a monthly basis now for quite a bit, and we think it's very important to bring the issue of equity and social balance into all our aspects of our life and our work. Here at the Employee Rights Center, we see it every day. We see how this is not a discussion that is fully, percolating and being in the sort of like meetings and sort of, strategic thinking that many organizations are having around town. And we think it's really important. We think if you're not doing this, you're probably behind on being the best business and the best, advocate for your clients, for your community. So we could hope to continue supporting this work. And thank you for being here and welcome.
Thank you very much, Alor. Research tells us that widespread cultural transformation requires united community effort. However, before we get to solutions, leaders need to agree on how they will generate change together. Women still have second-class status in the workplace and society. As a result, we live in a culture that normalizes lower recognition, respect, and reward for women than for men. Yet we continually push aside or dilute the mission of elevating women, and in the process, risk losing trillions of dollars in our economy. As Alor was saying, you are losing out. We lose tremendous workforce contributions and the financial stability of our strongest influencers of family health and wellness. Women in every identity group have historically been forced further behind the workplace starting line than men, and clearly evolution is not happening organically. So this is especially problematic when we look at the impact of crisis on already vulnerable women-owned businesses. The Kim Center partnered with the BID Alliance, County of San Diego Black Chamber, Rise San Diego, San Ysidro Chamber, and SDG&E on a study to understand how COVID changed the landscape for women business owners and leaders. The results help us identify which systemic issues are most active in our own backyard, so we can efficiently target solutions to prevent further vulnerability for women leaders in future crises. Today, I'm excited to welcome 3 community leaders to demonstrate the kind of collaborative brainstorming that will help us intentionally rebuild our workplace culture so that everyone receives the fair opportunities to succeed that they deserve. We have Stephanie Cook, who is Executive Director of the San Diego Women's Foundation. She has an extensive background in critical race and gender studies and women's empowerment and social justice issues. Stephanie serves on the board of Philanos, the National Network of Women's Collective Giving Organizations, and the Young Profit Professionals Network of San Diego, among many other things. Jason Paggio, actually I didn't ask, is that right, Paggio? Okay. Is President and CEO of San Diego's Asian Business Association and Asian Business Association Foundation. He also provides leadership for the California Asian Pacific Chamber of Commerce and serves on San Diego's Asian Pacific Islander Advisory Group and Small Business Advisory Board. Jason was recently named CEO of the Year by the San Diego Business Journal. Michelle Youngers is a management consultant and principal of Youngers Acuity, where she works to increase the organizational effectiveness of early-stage, high-growth companies. Michelle was a founding member of the San Diego Angel Conference and applies a gender lens to support female-founded enterprise and diverse leadership. She was also the founding president of the San Diego chapter of the Healthcare Businesswomen's Association. Welcome to you all, and thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us. Let's start with Michelle to help set the stage. How do women-owned businesses enrich the startup landscape, and why should investors care?
Thank you, Hei-ock, and to everybody, I'm really pleased to be here to share my thoughts on how we can collaborate for gender equity, especially as it relates to entrepreneurship. So why should we care? Investors should care because women are winning. That's just the bottom line. There is now ample data to show that women excel as entrepreneurs. One of the earliest studies, and it's my go-to on this particular topic, is the First Round 10-Year Project. And I think you're providing a link to that in the chat for our viewers. First Round was formed back in 2005 as an investment group with the objective of filling the gap between individual angel investing and Series A investing, which is typically venture capital, by investing in companies at what we refer to as the seed stage. They started capturing data at the very start on what was happening with companies in their community. And after 10 years, they were able to analyze the data set of 300 companies and almost 600 founders of those companies. They evaluated every company's performance by looking at how much their value had grown or not between their initial investment and the fair market value of the company at the time of the study, or if there had been an exit of the company. And what they captured were 10 lessons. And guess what number one was? Female founders outperform their male peers. They found that their investments in companies with at least one female founder were outperforming their investments in all male teams. Companies with female founders performed 63% better. So this is one of the first studies to really capture this data, and it's important. It's important for investors to know that. So, and then keep in mind, we all know that when a company is successful, it benefits more than the investors. Building an economic entity contributes to job creation and positively impacts in many ways the community that business operates in.
Thank you, Michelle. And I love that you bring up a study that was conducted consistently over 10 years, because that's the kind of effort that's really critical to this movement, and really any movement, is not only the collection of data, but consistent data over time. Does anybody else, would anyone else like to comment on this? Jason or Stephanie? Okay, well, we'll move to Jason. What is the value of diverse small business owners to the competitiveness of a region's market?
Well, thanks so much for having me, Dr. Kim. I think that, that's a great question, and sort of tacking on what Michelle was talking about. Similarly to what you had done with the Kim Center in terms of the study, simultaneously, I know we were having this conversation early on in terms of looking at, what does the ecosystem really look like in our landscape for small businesses and our workforce, and how does that diversity add to the competitiveness for our region? And sure enough, we wanted to do a deep dive and specifically to our demographic within the Asian American Pacific Islander population, and see, what is our workforce really contributing? What is the local economic impact? And sure enough, some of our key findings were even more significant than we originally anticipated. We found that API, or Asian Pacific Islander-owned small businesses throughout San Diego County, generated over $5 billion in economic impact in our region, and this was just this past year in 2021. And we also found that throughout that, with all the different businesses, we had found that there was over $43 million in local direct tax revenue, and that was between sales tax and property tax combined. And of that, between all the small businesses employed over 90,000 jobs created as a result of those API-owned businesses. So I think between all the over 30,000 API-owned businesses throughout the county, I think it's important that having that deeper dive within that workforce and the diversity within that, as you've done with your study, and being able to see how diverse is our workforce, and where can we make concerted efforts in making sure that nobody's left behind, especially throughout the pandemic. So I think as we look forward from the information we're able to receive with our study and the work that you have done, that we're able to combine that and have a much stronger and greater collective impact in terms of, just seeing just how, not just between the diversity, but how the long-term investment in a diverse workforce can contribute wholly to the recovery of this pandemic. So I think at a much greater scale, we're going to see conversations like this helping drive, I think, those policy decisions from a lot of our policymakers, local stakeholders, obviously philanthropy and other groups, and seeing that the direct benefit associated with the work that you're doing and groups like ours combined can contribute to a lot stronger local economy.
Thank you, Jason. We are so glad that you did that study on your end as well, because as even just a first step, one of the most important things is to change the narrative that people have in their minds of business owners, people in business, leaders, which is still predominantly white male, or at least male. And the fact is that these diverse groups are contributing, are participating in massive amounts to the business landscape, and then their potential, right now their contributions to the economy are relatively small, but the potential to really make a difference to the economic growth of our region is huge. We recently uncovered a statistic that women-owned businesses grew by 83% over, and I'm going to get this time frame wrong, it was an 8 or 10 year time frame in San Diego versus 28% of businesses as a whole, other businesses as a whole. So just projecting from there, and I'm sure there's a similar statistic for Black-owned businesses or Asian-owned business or AAPI-owned businesses, LGBT, etc. So there's a major load of data to consider here. Would anyone else? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, if I could tack on to what you were mentioning, but I guarantee you, if we were to look at the amount of investments made, whether they're locally through government entities to philanthropic to private dollars, I guarantee you that the level of investment has not matched that amount of growth between women-owned businesses. So I think that's where these conversations are really important, and taking that data and information and saying, hey, we are have a lower amount of investment in a certain demographic that we need to, and here's what supports that number. And I think that's a very key thing. So happy to be part of that discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Would anyone else like to comment at this point?
Yeah, hey, I'd love to jump in. My area of specialization is the philanthropic landscape and nonprofits. And I know that was sort of a small piece of the folks represented in your survey, Hei-ock. But I think that question about the value of diverse small business owners, you can really make the same case about nonprofit organizations that are run and led by folks from communities of color or those with lived experience. I think a really critical piece of making sure that our nonprofit sector is flourishing is making sure there's folks on our boards and in our decision-making bodies that are able to better represent the needs of the community.
Absolutely, and that leads perfectly into my next question, which is for you. Nonprofits contribute critical components of regional prosperity, not only socially, but economically as well. So what should people understand about the importance of women's spending power and everything related to that and feeding into that to charitable giving?
Yeah, thank you. Hey, this really is a great question. And there are so many ways to sort of dissect the data around charitable giving, but really the bottom line is that women are more likely to give than men, both in terms of what we in the sort of philanthropic sector call time and talent. So that's folks, getting involved with nonprofit organizations, volunteering, serving on boards, and of course, treasure, which is sort of how we refer to donations to charitable causes. And pre-pandemic, about 3/4 of women said that charitable giving was an important part of their lives, compared to just 69% of men. And I know that these numbers have sort of changed and shifted across the gender spectrum, especially over the past year, as so many individuals have stepped up to really support our community in response to the pandemic, and of course, to support racial justice work. But the trends do still prove that women are more likely to give. And an additional point to consider is that women are also more likely than men to give to charity as their income level rises. So I think this data point in particular is really interesting when you start looking at statistics on gender-based pay inequities or the findings of your COVID impact study and how women business owners fared during the pandemic, right? Because, you know, from this vantage point, you can really clearly see that when women are underpaid, the nonprofit and philanthropic landscape suffers. And when women's wages rise, they have more disposable income to direct to philanthropic causes. So when women thrive, communities thrive. You know, my organization, the San Diego Women's Foundation, we were founded 21 years ago in recognition that even though women often controlled sort of the charitable purse strings of their families, but there hadn't been a lot of effort to really bring women together to help them learn and grow in their philanthropic leadership. And I'm super proud that in 21 years, we've granted out more than $4.4 million to support nonprofits in San Diego. But organizations like mine, and there are a lot of really fabulous collective giving organizations in our region, can really only exist when women have the time and the funds to participate in collective giving.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I think we should also, it bears mentioning that as civic-minded people, women influence, they have large circles of influence, and they make decisions about where they're going to invest, where they're going to shop, where they may want to become employed themselves or recommend to their, you know, immediate circles where to work. And all of this influences how businesses do. So as both of our other panelists were mentioning in different ways, you know, employers really need to pay attention to how they land. Who they need to pay attention to, which demographics are going to help support them and which ones aren't. And small businesses and women-owned businesses are really right now coming to the forefront as an entity, a type of entity to support. So thank you very much for that insight into women leaders, civic leaders. Would anyone else like to comment?
Yeah, as I'm hearing Stephanie talk about the impact that women have, you know, one of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit later is the investment community. And we are seeing, just as women are making more and more decisions, you know, about charitable giving and philanthropic giving, we are seeing more and more women being able to have the opportunity to participate in investing. And when we have these women angel investors participating, they really do come in with more of a mindset of pay it forward and you know, and supporting women business owners. Many of them do. So.
Yes, thank you. So I'd like to move us into the more nitty-gritty brainstorming part of today's conversation. As representatives of your different stakeholder groups, please feel free to just throw stuff out there. None of this is, you know, we're not going to hold you to any of these things, but they are all going to feed the collective you know, creativity and innovativeness that our region needs to pull together. And the fact that we're doing this, having these conversations now, really positions San Diego to lead the nation in progress, because it is this collaborative effort that's going to make a difference as opposed to just waiting for it to happen. So my first question is for Jason. Women own more than 1/3 of all businesses, 39% of all businesses in San Diego. But they're only able to contribute at the moment about 10% of its annual revenue and hiring capacity. Now there's a big disconnect between those numbers. So which stakeholder groups are critical to developing the kind of structured plan that we need to achieve the full potential of women business owners?
That's a great question. If I could just back it up a little bit to, I think where at least the place that maybe I fit in this conversation, at least our organization, the Asia Business Association has been around for just over 30 years. And at least in our local impact in our community in terms of our investment, you know, we started out as an organization that did a lot of networking, did a lot of events, and also did business to business. We sort of transitioned over the last few years into becoming a service-based organization, becoming part of the San Diego Imperial Small Business Development Center network, which in many ways quantified the amount of work that we did and being able to see what kind of, not just what our clients look like in those businesses, but who we're actually servicing. And as we noted earlier with the studies we've been working on, it helps us become better service providers. I will say as an organization that when I was hired, I had said to the at least executive board that your biggest disadvantage is that you're hiring a male. ABA over the course of over 30 years has always had a female executive, the first paid executive director of the organization. Yen Tu is still on our executive board, Lonnie Lutar. We've had Joan, and we've also had our most recent CEO, Wendy Urashima-Khan. And I had said, but if we're going to take the step in hiring a male, we need to make sure that we are thoughtful in our approach and that our leadership is balanced and that we always have a female leader. So fortunately for us, we've always had a female board chair. And as we've looked at the market and developed ourselves, over 70% of our employees are actually female, and a lot of those business advisors are female business advisors. So, and all of them have at some point owned a company or own a company. So that helped us in being able to establish ourselves within our network as being a group that's at least looking forward in terms of who we're servicing. And a group that we work very closely within the SBDC network here in San Diego and Imperial Valley is the Women's Business Center. So we are closely aligned with the San Diego Imperial Women's Business Center and all the WBCs in the state. There are about 16 of them. We can say that over last year in 2021, of the over 5,000 small businesses that we serviced, 48% of them were women owned. So it's a pretty significant number of that. And 18% of them were Black businesses, 14% were AAPI owned, and 38% were Latinx owned. In terms of capital, I know we were talking a little bit about that earlier. What access was being able to given to certain funding, whether it's disaster relief capital or traditional loans. We helped women businesses access over $29 million in capital compared to Black businesses were over $5 million, and then AAPI was over $25 million, and Latinx was over $26 million. So there was a larger share there. That's obviously not representative of everything within the region, but at least in the efforts, and I think the thoughtfulness of the SBDC network here and how we approach things, having, I think those policy points driven up top of mind certainly help how we approach this. So I think from, if you could help me with the question originally, what stakeholders are important in this process, I would say, engaging, as you've done with us, more affinity groups that are either culturally based, because even within them, we have our own challenges in reaching, additional demographics within those, and a lot of those barriers. The women's business centers, of course, are incredibly important. And a lot of groups where you have, I think, female leaders within them. I think having those folks have that seat at the table to work with us collectively as a decision maker is incredibly important. And so, I mean, off the top of my head, those are the groups that I could think of. I think obviously the ones you have here that are speaking to all these different points, but there are so many different groups. I think to your point as well, the San Diego region has this perfect ecosystem, and I've done a lot of work across the state and other markets, but I believe that San Diego has a very special ecosystem that it's much more manageable, whether it's our healthcare system, to either philanthropic or giving, to even the business ecosystem. I think it's a much more manageable place because there's a little bit more of a togetherness, and I think a thoughtfulness of all of us working together. So I do think we can become and will become the model for the rest of the nation by continuing to have these discussions. So, if you come back to me, I'll probably come up with 5 more groups, I think, at the end of this that we could probably engage, but those are the first ones I could think of off the top of my head.
Thank you, Jason. We're keeping a list. Michelle, did you want to chime in there?
Yeah, I do, because when I was listening to the statistics in terms of the number of businesses yet not contributing as much, tells me that there's potential for these companies to grow, right? And that's how they're going to do that. So when I think of stakeholders, having been a female entrepreneur, I think of all the people we come in touch with when we're operating our business, and those are really, really key stakeholders. I'm talking about bankers. I'm talking about maybe even a real estate agent who's helping you negotiate your lease. anybody that you come into, your accountant, your lawyer, these are all groups, these are all stakeholder groups that really need to get on board with having a focus and helping to provide the needed resources for the businesses that they're serving.
Thank you, Michelle. And I think an important aspect to remember is when we pull all the stakeholder groups together, not everyone is going to be an expert, so to speak. The goal is to learn as much as to contribute. And that's why having the different stakeholder groups together is pretty critical to teach each other what the other groups may not know about your perspective, your constituency, the needs of your constituency, etc. So great point is that, there are a lot of groups that need to be involved.
And basic education on bias. I mean,
Yes,
I think a lot of individuals just really, really don't understand that, how biased they can be.
Yeah.
Right. It's just something that they grew up with. So it really does need a change of thinking.
Right. And what we need to make clear also is that women-owned businesses don't produce less revenue and have fewer hirees because they're women-owned businesses directly. There's no direct connection between that. Much of the reason is simply that they have less access to resources, and that is because they are women. Banks give them less, and you made mention of this earlier, they get smaller loans, fewer loans, higher interest rates, shorter payback times. They get less investment, which I'll cover in the next question. And so they have less access to capital and other resources that would allow other businesses to grow. So we're just trying to help them reach their potential, which is the same potential as any other business. Stephanie, did you have a comment there?
No, I mean, I'll touch on something a little bit later, but I just wanted to quickly share that some of those same statistics play out in the nonprofit space, and you'll see that women in nonprofits are also underrepresented in some of the most well-funded groups.
Yes, absolutely. Jason, do you have that additional list of 5 yet?
Working on it.
Thank you. I'll segue into Michelle. Female founders receive, in this case, 1 to 3% of all venture capital funding. I mean, if you could I can't even wrap my head around that. You have 100% of venture capital funding and women receive a drop in the bucket. A lot needs to be said and understood and done about that. And as you mentioned earlier, Michelle, they produce more than twice the return of male founders. So there's definitely something really going wrong there. But there are things that that have the potential to make a shift, help us all make a shift. So what activities in San Diego do you see supporting this need to invest in the untapped resource that women entrepreneurs represent?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm actually happy to report that there is a lot of interesting activity going on, and certainly we're all in agreement that the most effective way to elevate women is to invest in them. The status of women is to invest in them. One thing that's really important is I think that there need to be more resources to educate women business owners on alternate forms of financing. Because this statistic is certainly, venture capital, but, traditional venture capital is not the only source for this. We are seeing more female-focused, social impact-focused funds in the last few years, which is very, very encouraging. But most of these are comprised of angel investors. So these are individuals that have accumulated wealth, that have decided that they want to, support early stage companies. So there has not only been a significant increase in angel investing, especially in San Diego, but the barrier to entry has changed quite a bit. So people are getting more creative about this. And that has been very positive for women, to get women involved in angel investing, which I think is really important to help change this whole dialogue, right? One group that I'm involved with is the San Diego Angel Conference. I think you mentioned that in my introduction. I was a founding member of that. It was formed in 2019 with the aim to build in Southern California an ecosystem around investing. Excuse me. So individuals that with no experience in angel investing can get involved with this. And what I mean about the barrier to entry is it's not like some of the existing angel groups where you can't even participate unless you come in for a minimum of $25,000. The Angel Conference, you can come in with one unit costing you $5,500, right? And that is really, really a reduction of the barrier to entry. So individuals can participate who have had no angel investing, and part of the conference is to educate on the process of investing in early stage companies. You know, what does it take to understand the company? A big part of this is understanding the management team, and that's always been certainly my focus. I always say that I invest as much in the founder of that company as I do their product or service. So individuals can learn the process of angel investing. It's not a specific goal of the San Diego Angel Conference to invest in women-owned businesses, but I'm pleased to say that our winners over the last 3 years have been, each company has been a woman-led company. So, right, so we don't have the lens. I mean, some of us within the group do, and we constantly have to advocate, you know, for women leaders, or diversity even on the founding executive team of the company. So, you know, we have to vocally advocate for that. But what that is telling us is that, again, women are winners, right? They present, they have a solid business plan, they are passionate about what they're doing, and they are attracting angel investing. So these small groups are really creating quite an impact, I think, in the ecosystem here in San Diego. And you mentioned the need to collaborate. It's a collaborative effort. So the other thing I think about is, you know, what are the existing groups that have these touch points with women entrepreneurs, and do they have a focus to help to solve this? I'll mention Connect San Diego. If any of you are familiar with Connect, this organization has been very ingrained in San Diego's landscape, providing education and mentorship for entrepreneurs. They also work to attract investment dollars to the San Diego ecosystem. And as a result of this effort to attract dollars, VC venture capital dollars coming into San Diego companies grew from 1 billion to 9 billion in the last 6 years. So what we're seeing now is the impact of more dollars in the ecosystem, but with more dollars in the ecosystem, we need to do more. We need to have really a focus on how are we going to create impact with businesses to support diversity in ownership. And Connect just announced, they've been around for many, many years. They just announced that they realized that they could do better in this area. And, you know, realizing that the innovation sector is not as diverse as we would like it to be, and acknowledging that if we have a focus on diversity, it'll create more economic opportunities all around. So they have appointed a new director to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion through all their work. And I'm very, very pleased to see that. And then flipping that a little bit, there are groups that are focused on gender equity that haven't always had a direct initiative to support entrepreneurship. One example is the Healthcare Business Women's Association. So when I was president of the San Diego chapter, one of the things that we did is I looked at what my San Diego constituency was for growing membership, and realized that there was such a high percentage of early stage companies, and many of these early stage companies were owned and run by women. The HBA does have an affinity group called entrepreneurship, but even on the Pacific Coast, so we were part of a Pacific region of chapters, it wasn't active, which really, really surprised me, because that's, we're kind of the hotbed of entrepreneurship and startup companies. So when I started looking at or talking to these companies to get them to participate, one of the things I realized was the whole structure of the organization didn't allow for them to become corporate partners with Healthcare Businesswomen's Association, because again, coming in as a corporate partner for $5,000 to $6,000 was just not practical for early stage companies. So what we did is we were very active about, as myself and another chapter president, we were very active with working with our central organization to then form a partnership level for early stage companies. And I'm proud to say in San Diego, we had the very first corporate partner, startup corporate partner. So, but this is how collaboration needs to happen, right? So existing organizations that are focused on gender parity don't even have sometimes a focus on this. So.
Thank you, Michelle, for that extensive perspective. If we were to take what you said and twist it a little bit to focus on measurable progress, because one of our goals with this collaborative effort is to create a San Diego specific playbook, something that we can use both to guide us and also to hold us accountable to progress. Obviously, one of the metrics could be, how many dollars are actually being invested in women-owned businesses, right? And then other metrics are, revenue and hiring capacity. But it sounds like there are other ones that could be teased out of what you're talking about as well, that individual organizations can use to measure their own impact. Do you want to just kind of clarify some of those?
Yeah, I know I kind of segued a little bit into, just kind of advocating for it as opposed to the direct question, which was about investing, right? But it is a matter of raising awareness, because when I think about, let me just use Healthcare Businesswomen's Association as an example. It's a global organization of 10,000 members, but we do have these local chapters, and the local chapters need to really program based on what their constituency is all about. So that's why, we were really focused on entrepreneurship and this affinity group. But HBA has access to venture capital through their big corporate partners. Every large pharmaceutical company, for example, because this happens to be in healthcare, every large pharmaceutical company has a venture arm. And why couldn't they, advocate for investment among their memberships through that channel, right? So I guess does that answer your question? I mean, that's how I think about it, to really kind of how do we address it, right? So why not give some visibility to HBA members who are entrepreneurs, with those connections.
If I may,
go ahead, Jason.
Michelle, you just, for me, a lot of things sparked in my head as you were speaking. I came up with a few other members from the stakeholders, the San Diego Age Conference, you and Connect, the Brink, they're all part of the SBDC network. So I think in terms of that thoughtfulness, that's a few different key groups that could certainly be helpful. But as you were talking, Michelle, in terms of corporate partnerships and what that looked like, especially for startups or other groups that were looking to get involved in the space, I think that throughout COVID, we've sort of redefined how a lot of these investments or partnerships happen. And if there was a good time to do it, it was, throughout the pandemic. We had made, as membership-based organizations, ended up making all of our small business memberships free. And I think that changed the way that we were able to access those who would typically, join. I think chambers struggled for the most part of being able to retain memberships if they weren't providing a service. For us, there were two sides of the house. And in our case, we said, well, we still get paid to provide a free service or no cost consulting for small businesses. Why don't we just make our small business membership free? And we've actually kept it going. So from that perspective, we found that we had more people that were willing to invest to make the service and membership free so that we could have more touch points and access more people and help our local economy. So that was kind of interesting to see how in this time, if there was a shift, and especially with corporate partners, they're looking at their investments very differently because the landscape's changed so much. And I think Michelle's comments, I think, have stayed true. And I think that this ecosystem has made it so that we can continue to have those conversations on how corporate partnerships are working, or even philanthropic, which Stephanie, I'm sure, could speak to. But that, the landscape is changing in the way that we look and approach these different things. And it can hopefully continue to happen where we're completely changing, I think, the model. So great. This all inspires more ideas and thoughts here. So enjoy it.
Love that. Disrupt the model.
Absolutely. And that's the idea behind equity. We're in the process of giving a leg up, so to speak, to certain groups. There are other groups who may be going, well, what about us? But the fact is, if you have been historically marginalized, you need extra effort to get you to the same starting line that everyone else has. So, I love, for example, the making membership free to small businesses. I mean, that's an advantage. And COVID was absolutely, thank you for bringing that back around to COVID. COVID surfaced the crack, or exacerbated rather, the cracks in the system that already exist from historical discrimination. And that's why we just ended up reinforcing, women business owners tend to be one of the most vulnerable groups in times of crisis. Stephanie, did you have any comments around this?
Yeah, I mean, this whole conversation about corporate partnerships, I think it's so fascinating because those also play a really important role in the nonprofit landscape. As partners to foundations like mine, I'm a foundation and a 501c3, but also to nonprofits in the community. And I don't have the data points handy, but I think you could probably make a really clear case by looking at the corporate sponsor pages of well-known and already well-funded nonprofit organizations, that they have some big name funders, whereas, smaller community-based grassroots organizations that are really, founded and led by folks with lived experience, I would imagine have a harder time, securing those partnerships. So I think there's space for us to widen that conversation and include how important those stakeholders are in the nonprofit landscape as well.
Yes, thank you. And I'm really glad to have you here. I mean, as a nonprofit, and that was founded by a woman, we recognize the importance of foundations and philanthropists and nonprofits to the economy in general, the business world. So I'm really happy to have your perspective involved in this conversation. Women tend to receive less funding and recognition as nonprofit leaders and founders. How can foundations help shift this narrative? Do you see metrics that could effectively measure progress?
Yeah, this is a good question, a difficult question, right? I mean, nonprofits are mission-driven organizations that exist, hopefully, to make the world a little bit better, but that doesn't mean that the nonprofit landscape isn't fraught with the same issues as for-profit organizations. I think similar to some statistics you were sharing earlier, Jason, women make up about 75% of nonprofit employees, and yet they are vastly underrepresented in leadership positions. And in fact, I think it's estimated that only 25% or so of leaders at the largest and most well-funded nonprofit organizations are women. And even when women do rise to positions of power, they are still paid less. I always like looking every year at Candid's nonprofit compensation report, where they look over the tax returns of charitable organizations. And I think the last statistic I saw was from 2020, and they shared that women CEOs at nonprofits earn, I believe, 75% of what men do. And of course, foundations are part of that nonprofit landscape. So we are part of the problem, but also have a role to play in being part of the solution. And I mean, I can think of a lot of simple steps that sort of span from the nonprofit to the for-profit sector that have been effective in promoting pay equity. California is one of the states that bars employers from asking applicants about their salary history. And I think we can all agree that that's had a positive impact. Data also shows that in nonprofits and for-profits, of course, simply posting the salary range of a position has helped decrease the gender wage gap. So I think internally, nonprofits and foundations can adopt those and similar strategies. Something that Michelle mentioned earlier, implicit bias training. I think that's so massively important for foundation and folks in the funder space. really taking a look at who, we are in the business of investing. We're just investing in not-for-profit organizations, and really trying to sort of unpack how our internalized biases may affect where we're directing our funds, who we're entrusting, whose vision of community change we align ourselves with. I think there's a lot of work we could do to sort of audit where our funds go, who's being hired, who's being promoted, and figure out how that impacts, gender parity within the sector. But I think another really important thing that foundations specifically can do is just look at where our sphere of influence is, right? As grant-making organizations, we can do that work internally, but we can also seek to partner with nonprofits that adopt similar strategies to promote equity within their senior leadership, their board of directors, organizations, of course, that exist to empower women leaders in the community. And I think another important piece of that is providing general operating support. This is the biggest conversation piece, I think, for most grant-making organizations right now, is how important it is for us to be supporting the people who do the work, right? There's so many, funders who want to give directly to the cause and provide program restricted funding, but that work doesn't get done without really dedicated people. So if foundations would take a bigger role in providing unrestricted and general operating support, we could enable the nonprofit landscape to better pay its resources, its people. So I, for one, would love to see more nonprofits really embrace the principles of trust-based philanthropy and gift funds without restrictions.
Well, I am very excited to hear you say that, because you're absolutely right. And there's a strange statistic out there as well, representing the bias against minority leaders, or leaders who are from minority groups, which is that foundations tend to give less money to those demographic types, more involved hurdles, even if they're running a nonprofit that represents the interests of their own groups, so who would know better than them? And yet the funders still tend to favor white men or white women as leaders in their funding practices. And I like what you said, that foundations are in the business of investing. They're just investing in nonprofits. So yes, they are a critical part of the business landscape. Does anyone have any comments regarding the last question?
Everything Stephanie said was music to my ears. I think, and I like to tell people when they're looking at investing in the work that we do and having to hire culturally competent business advisors who could speak, multiple languages. I always argue to people that it is not cheaper to invest in us, that it is more expensive to communicate to a demographic. But the results of that, as we've seen from these studies, is that everything is far better because of it. But you have to front load those resources and making sure that, but at the same time, we do our job to make sure that we understand where you're investing your money in and where the return is. I think the restriction of fundings, and you look at most government entities in terms of the 5 to 10% on the admin, is nowhere near enough really what ends up happening on the back end in terms of servicing a lot of these agreements and grants. But even beyond that, I think the investment that needs to happen towards certain kinds of leaders or leadership and being able to communicate the demographics that are wholly missed is certainly a lot more expensive. And I think my hope is that, as we go through, the recovery of the pandemic, that, Stephanie, when you're taking a look at 990s again, or looking at Candid, being able to see, 2 years from now that, has the pay disparity changed? Are we going to see that, or did it get more exacerbated throughout the pandemic? Obviously, hopefully not, as we have these discussions, but I think that'll definitely be really interesting to see in the coming years.
Yeah, and I want to highlight one other thing that you mentioned, which is the sphere of influence. Every company, every employer, every nonprofit, every representative of a key stakeholder group has a sphere of influence. And in speaking up, speaking out, acting in specific ways, prioritizing certain interests and value systems, we will create that ripple effect. And, as has been mentioned, those companies and entities that prioritize diversity and equitable distribution of leadership opportunities and resources will simply outcompete those that don't. So yes, thank you very much for that perspective. Michelle, did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, again, because I love disruptive thinking. I do think even in philanthropy, if any of you are aware of the Alliance Healthcare Foundation and what they run every year with the I2 Innovation Grant, again, that's a great way to approach this, because it's not just the internal team making decisions. They bring these outside experts in, they evaluate, the applicants pitch just like they're going for, other type of investment money. And so it's just, I think, a very fresh approach to doing this. So, and the approach itself can lend itself to, breaking down those bias barriers.
Yes, thank you. That's absolutely true. I think we have a comment from Alor, and then we can move into the Q&A section.
Yeah, there's a question in which I'll post to you just at the end, but I just wanted to say real quick that from the point of view of many of the people that we see today or every day, all the time at the Employer Rights Center, there's a lot of entrepreneurship that really wants to grow and wants to sort of know how to get out there and become a better entrepreneur. And I would say money is definitely a huge consideration, like getting that initial seed funding to step you into the possibility of actually having a going concern. It's huge. But in our experience, people who have a second or a third income, who have a side business or job that could really scale, they have another factor that's really missing in their progress, which is mentorship. And I would say this is especially critical for women and minorities. It seems like we don't have metrics or a plan that sets out a certain amount of women and minorities that will have the kind of accessible mentorship for 6 months, for a year, that can really get them through the difficult parts of becoming a different level or reach a different level of leadership. And over we find there are people who want to try something, they just have a hard time getting, one-on-one assistance or mentorship that can put them to the next level. And so I just really want to bring that to a discussion, that strong mentorship program for women business owners could be, in our opinion, really critical. But before I go, there's a question there, which is, what are a couple practical things that people can do, women owners can do, to raise their profile and get more investment?
Should we punt that to Michelle?
I guess it just depends on, the business, the type of business, again, and the type of investment that's needed. And that's the first step. And maybe it goes to the mentorship program, right? Is to really have an idea, sit down with a mentor, or have access to an educational program that really provides them with, what are the various ways that I can finance my business? Because there really are just some very creative ways of doing that. I know that's one of the things the San Diego Angel Conference offers. Even if you don't apply to come through our Pitch Fest, we do have an entrepreneur series exactly for this. And you learn about financials, you learn about presenting, you learn about forms of financing. So I think these programs are out there. I think the challenge is, how do we bring visibility to them? Collaboration through these other organizations is certainly key to that.
Yeah, that you bring up a good point, that there are multiple organizations out there designed to help the early stage of companies, small businesses, and actually a lot of them are nonprofits too. So supporting them is important to ultimately supporting the small business owner. Any other responses or thoughts sparked by the question you wanted to share, or anyone wants to share? Okay, we do have another question. This one's for Jason. What are some challenges the AAPI business community faced in San Diego during the pandemic? Yeah.
Great question. Some of the things that we had sort of known anecdotally at the beginning of the pandemic was that, as the virus, news of the virus had come across the Pacific, we had seen that in a lot of our cultural corridors, a noticeable impact. It was around this time, it was around Lunar New Year, where we were supposed to have, tons of events, where people stopped having activity, people stopped shopping locally. At least in our communities, there were a lot less gatherings, events were canceled. And that was just on the idea that, this virus originated from China and not anything to the statistics that we had eventually found out about. So that compounded effect was also demonstrated in our study that showed that early on, the API community was not only hit, but hit harder. And that compounding effect exacerbated our ability for funding and resources. And by the time that a lot of the disaster relief capital come down, we were woefully behind a lot of our counterparts. And I think from that perspective, what ended up happening when a lot of the funding was first come, first serve, we had a lot of, as many in the BIPOC communities experienced technological barriers in terms of being able to access grants online. And then even further was a lot of language barriers when we had to turn in documents within 24 to 48 hours or even 72 hours, having to bring in a translator to get those grants or funds translated and getting that to our community. We found ourselves as quickly as we could partnering with more community-based organizations instead of just business development organizations. So that was a very big impediment early on, was the compounding early effects hit to our community, and then a lot of the cultural language barriers associated with even how grant funding was given to different communities, and was it done in multiple languages. I remember at one point with some of our electeds, we were arguing with them on, you just don't use Google Translate. That's just not how you get things to certain communities that are missed. So it's come a long way since then, but it doesn't mean we're not still behind. But those were some of the things we experienced early on and continue to in terms of language and accessibility.
Well, and that's a very good point that speaks to people's confusion. One of the statistics that came out of our report was that a significant percentage of the small business owners didn't apply for aid because they didn't know what programs were available or if they qualified. So if you're just thinking in your sort of everyday, everybody speaks English kind of whatever, head space you might be in, which I totally admit I am most of the time in, it's a question where you think, well, why not? But you totally bring to light all, so many of the reasons why not. And this is where organizations such as ABA need to step in, need to have the support to be able to step in and support, in turn, those business owners with, challenges like that. Would anyone else like to speak to that question?
I just want to add that point about language and accessibility is so well taken. I think there's a lot of work that the nonprofit community can do to make sure that our grants applications are accessible, that we're not further burdening nonprofits that are already responding to really critical level crises in our community. And, create space too when we're defining what impact we want to see in the community, that it's not happening in a vacuum. We may not be the people best suited to decide what food insecurity should look like. Instead, we should be having those conversations with folks impacted by the issue and really working in collaboration to define what intervention measures should look like.
Thank you all so much. 3 o'clock has caught me off guard. I want to thank all our participants for generously sharing, again, your time and your insights. And thanks to our audience for joining us for this episode of Uniting for Workplace Equity. We hope you'll like and share this post and add your questions or thoughts in the comments as they come to you. And then join us again in February on the third Tuesday for our next panel exploring how uniting community stakeholder groups can drive deep change. Have a great day, and thank you, everyone.